What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we finally have all the rules for the Space Marine sub-factions within 10th edition Warhammer 40k. So let's talk a little bit about the differences between individual chapters and how they scale up against one another. We're going to be jumping on a tier list today, and I'm going to give you my power ranking for Space Marine chapters in 10th edition 40k. As always, if you enjoy my Warhammer 40k content, go ahead and drop a like on the video, subscribe on the channel, all the YouTube stuff, maybe a nice little comment telling me what your favorite Space Marine chapter is. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is exactly how Space Marine chapters work in 10th edition, because it's much different than they have in the past. It appears that Space Marines are going to be the only faction in the game that has a sub-faction mechanic. Now, obviously, a faction is one of the many armies in Warhammer 40,000, like Space Marines or Tyranids, but a sub-faction traditionally has been a differentiation between different armies within that faction, where you could play armies hailing from a particular Space Marine chapter, Adeptus Mechanicus Forge World, Tyranid High Fleet, and those would all have slightly different rules. Those mechanics have been largely removed in 10th edition, with the only thing really aping them being the new detachment rules. But Space Marines are the exception. Space Marines have distinct sub-factions, and thanks to the chapter rules within the Space Marine Index, we know that you can choose a Space Marine chapter when you construct your army, and if you choose a chapter keyword, which is listed down in your faction keywords, it's whatever isn't Space Marines, you can't include any units with a different faction keyword. So while generic units that don't have a sub-faction keyword can go into any Space Marine army, units that are keyworded Space Wolf can only go with other Space Wolf units or generic units. Similarly, Blood Angels can't be combined with any Black Templars, they can only go with generic units or other Blood Angels. Furthermore, you can also have some successor characters which retain their sub-faction keyword, things like Gabriel Seth, who has the Blood Angels keyword, but can't be taken with other epic heroes, since those epic heroes are Blood Angels proper, and he is in fact a Flesh Terror. Now, there aren't that many rules that you gain from choosing a sub-faction. It's basically just unlocking different units to be taken in your army. However, choosing one of these sub-factions unlocks access to a special faction detachment. Now, the detachment will actually restrict your unit selection further. It's optional, you don't have to play within the faction detachment. You could play in the generic Gladius Strike Force, and if you do so, not only do you get to use all of the normal Gladius Strike Force rules, but you can also take units unrestricted. As long as they don't come from multiple chapters, you actually don't have to suffer the restrictions that the detachment imposes on you. So for example, if you are in the Black Templar specific detachment, you can't take Psychers, but if you're playing Black Templars in a standard Gladius detachment, you can. Now, to be fair, this could get FAQ'd in the future. I'm not entirely sure where they would put it, maybe an addendum to the Space Marine Index proper, but at the time of recording, that's how the rule works. So the non-compliant chapters like Blood Angels, Space Wolves, Black Templars, Deathwatch, or Dark Angels are all able to take specific detachments. But if you choose one of the other chapters, you simply get access to some epic heroes that you can play within your normal Gladius Strike Force. So what we're going to be doing today is considering these chapters both within their normal detachment and within the Strike Force, kind of a holistic view of all of the options they have available to them and comparing them to one another. So let's dive in. Now, I've rated this tier list between fine, okay, good, which is right in the middle, pretty good, or super good, which are the factions you're going to be considering to take most often. Down on the bottom rung, we have the fine factions. These are White Scars and Iron Hands, two factions that have single kind of mediocre characters. How far the mighty have fallen with Iron Hands, and while the Iron Hands theme of taking vehicles and tech marines is probably going to be reflected in most Space Marine armies going into 10th edition, the Iron Hands themselves aren't actually that great at it. Their only character available to them is Iron Father Fieros, who retains his really bizarre mishmash of different mechanics. He himself is a tech marine and gets bonuses for standing near vehicles, but also grants bonuses to an attached unit of infantry, usually Gravis armored infantry. What you can do is put him in an Eradicator squad and then sort of use that to sidle up alongside his vehicles, but it means that he's not necessarily keeping pace with them, and he's going to be sort of stuck to this unit. He does make units like Aggressor significantly harder to kill, but then again, you're using him in this aggressive stance where he can't really make use of his abilities. Corsaro Khan is the only epic hero character for White Scars. This dude is fine, I guess. He gives you Lance and Assault to a unit that he's attached to, and can attach to some solid melee infantry like Assault Intercessors. But again, kind of like Iron Father Furos, he's nothing to write home about. He's not really anything that you can't get access to in other factions, and he's the only benefit for playing White Scars. Moving on, we have Raven Guard and their chapter master, Caven Shrike. Now, unlike the other two characters, this guy's base profile is actually sick. He has an immense melee damage output with a pair of 2 damage lightning claws with the precision and twin linked abilities, allowing him to really cleave through even medium weight enemy characters pretty well once he gets into melee. He has a solid 2 damage ranged attack, and prevents his unit from being targeted by ranged attacks unless it's within 12. In my winners and losers of the Space Marine Index video that I released earlier today, I actually discussed how powerful this ability is and how warping I think it's going to be to the 10th edition metagame, and having that applicable to a melee unit that Caven Shrike joins is actually sweet. He's also a base loan operative, so you can kind of play him by himself, and that actually might be pretty reasonable, since he's just a pretty solid jump infantry smash character all on his lonesome. That said, the units that he joins are not exciting. Either Jump Pack Assault Marines or Jump Pack Vanguard Veterans, neither of which are units that are particularly cool. And he doesn't actually buff the unit offensively beyond making them harder to hit. So I actually do like Caven Shrike as a character, and I think his profile is actually incredibly strong. But as the only benefit to playing Raven Guard, he's a little bit lackluster. I think he's a solid choice if you want to play Raven Guard, but there's a big opportunity cost from playing a chapter that has more interesting characters. Moving on to Imperial Fists, these guys have actually seen a pretty meteoric rise since their 9th edition counterparts did them dirty with some real bad stratagems and subfaction abilities. However, their characters are super solid. You get access to potentially 3-ish characters playing Imperial Fists, although one of them is a Crimson Fist. Pedro Cantor can't be taken alongside the other characters, but we'll throw him in the mix here and discuss him now, just because I can't really be bothered to split out all of the successor chapters. Pedro Cantor is a pretty sweet dude. He's got a 3 damage power fist, which is always great, and he increases the number of attacks his unit makes by 1, but similar to Caven Shrike, he can't be really attached to anything particularly exciting. You can stick him into Stern Guard Veterans, and that's about as good as it gets, but otherwise, he's not super sweet. That isn't the case, however, for the other Imperial Fist characters, who not only bring powerful support effects, they also attached to units that really make use of those support effects. The first one is Lysander. He gives you the new equivalent of the transhuman effect. If your opponent's strength is higher than your toughness, they get -1 to wound, so most attacks will wound his unit on 4s, some of them on 3s, but without any anti-infantry style effects, you can never get better than a 3. He joins Terminator squads, and he himself is a beat stick and can be extremely survivable, granting a once per game 2+ invulnerable save. So even if his unit goes down, Darnath Lysander is going to stand strong and probably survive for at least another round of combat, hitting people with that big old Thunderhammer. Whether or not that opportunity cost for other characters that would join a Terminator unit, which are the only units that he can enter into, is too much, I don't know, but he's certainly worth considering. On the flip side, though, Tor Garradon is an absolute godsend for large aggressor teams. He can join most Gravis armored units, including aggressors and eradicators, and grants them both lethal hits and ignore cover. This is amazing for both eradicators and Boltstorm aggressor units. On top of that, he is a monster in melee. He comes stock with a strength 12, AP 2 damage power fist, which is already good, but once he attacks a monster vehicle or fortification, it becomes strength 14, AP 4 damage. And given the fact that most of the heavy, hard-to-kill targets in the game are monsters and vehicles, and as we've talked about before, monsters and vehicles are going to be incredibly powerful, not only is that an incredible melee profile, but this guy's also rocking a grav gun, giving him a 2+ anti-vehicle 2 damage weapon to shoot in the shooting phase. That's also going to be ignoring cover and getting lethal hits because of his own Signum effect, as long as he joined into the unit. On top of being a tough Gravis profile with 6 wounds and toughness of 6, I think Tor Garradon is an absolute powerhouse. This guy's so cool. He's going to drop into Eradicator or Aggressor teams and just absolutely be a late game anchor for a lot of Space Marine game plans. Well, he's the biggest benefit you get from playing Imperial Fists, and again, there's a lot of opportunity cost lost from the other chapters. I do think playing Imperial Fists for Tor Garradon is certainly a worthwhile exercise. That moves us on to the mid-tier that I think are pretty good, and the first one I'm going to talk about is Salamanders. Now, the big benefit that you get from playing Salamanders is, again, a couple special characters. You get Vulcan Heston and Adrax Agatone, both of which are pretty solid. Adrax is an incredible include for something like an Assault Intercessor squad, granting full wound rerolls in melee, which is incredible. He's also got a good melee attack, some objective control shenanigans, and a pretty strong flamethrower. So altogether, I can't really complain about this dude. On the flip side, Vulcan Heston is an insane force multiplier. He allows you to get full wound rerolls with Torrent or Melta weapons against an enemy within 24 inches of him every turn. So basically, he's kind of doing a little bit of a Gilliman ape, where you get a second O's of Moment target as long as you target them with flamers and Melta guns and stuff like that. Now, a lot of the Melta units in the Codex do get rerolls already. Flamestorm Aggressors already reroll because their weapons are twin-linked, and Eradicators reroll if they target monsters or vehicles, but he opens up the opportunity to take more Melta-focused vehicles potentially and gain those rerolls from himself. On top of that, he also has his cool Seeker of Lost Relics, which allows you to dominate the center of the battlefield. Either he can play defensively and he can hold down his backline objective by himself, or he becomes an OC-10 model in the middle of the table once he's able to get there. While he's not the most survivable character ever or the most exciting in melee, his profiles are fine, and alongside all of those other benefits, I think he's going to be pretty worthwhile. Both of these characters are great, and I think both of them slot very easily into Salamander's armies, which is why I think I put them at the top of the non-Ultramarine Codex compliant chapters. Next up, we have Space Wolves, and these guys have had a bunch of discussion around them just because of the mechanics granted in their index. Now, to be perfectly honest, there's a bunch of typos in their index, and I have a sneaking suspicion it's going to get like a day one FAQ, and there's going to be a lot of changes made. Some weapon profiles and upgrade charts are certainly borked and kind of buggy, and I would expect to see those changed. Ultimately, the abilities granted by their detachment are not that exciting, and Space Wolves units are generally kind of side grade versions of the core Codex units. That said, Space Wolf characters like Murderfang or Logan Grimnir are both pretty good, and you can just play them in a normal Gladius detachment. Murderfang especially, I think, ends up being probably one of the higher damage characters in the entire game once you start triggering his double or triple attack ability, and while delivering him is really problematic, you can probably find a way to do it with the Stormraven gunship or a rapid ingress in your opponent's turn from Strategic Reserve, and if you do so, you just get a sweet melee powerhouse. One thing it's important to keep in mind with Space Wolves and these other factions that don't look particularly strong by themselves is that they're already going to use the floor of the Space Marine Codex. I talked in the last video about some incredibly powerful Space Marine combos, and that's available to every single Space Marine chapter. You're not really relying on unique chapter mechanics to make any of these work, so you can slot those into any Space Marine army. So if you're a hardcore Space Wolves player and you want to keep putting Logan Grimnir and Ragnar Blackmane and these incredible Space Wolf characters on the table, I think you will definitely see success, just because if there are any good Space Marine combos, they're still going to be available to you. Now, moving on, we can talk about Dark Angels. I wasn't really sure where to put these guys. They're kind of a tough one to suss out. Certainly the tankiest of the Space Marine sub-factions, with units like Deathwing Knights able to stack enormous amounts of damage resistance effects. That said, just being tanky doesn't necessarily make you particularly exciting, and I think a lot of these units are going to pay out the nose for their level of resilience. A lot of times they rely on being battle shocked themselves in order to increase their damage output, at least if you're playing their bespoke detachment, but I think a lot of the times you're just going to be playing them in a Gladius Strike Force anyway. So while I'll put Dark Angels in the mid tier here, I do think it remains to be seen whether or not their level of resilience is enough to make them worthwhile, even above the other Space Marine armies that are going to play a little bit more aggressively. Now, speaking of some aggressive armies, we can move up to the pretty good tier and talk about Black Templars. Now, I think Black Templars kind of play a little bit of a straightforward game plan. They just want to run across the table and hit you with, Inky, come on. They just want to run across the table and hit you with chain swords, and they're extremely good at doing that. The base Primaris Crusader profile has a 5-attack chainsword and is able to grant them lethal hits, sustained hits, hit rerolls from attached characters, and they can absolutely send that profile through the roof. Inky's here now, so she's going to give her thoughts on some Space Marine faction power level as well. I'm sure she's got a lot. Black Templars are another tough one to judge. They have a lot of strong melee infantry, but they play much differently than other Space Marine subfactions. I think they're one of the few chapters that really rely on their bespoke detachment, and I think that makes them a little bit less consistent than the other chapters potentially. They're really incentivized to play alongside their Templar vows. That said, they can flood the board with pretty lethal melee threats, and I think are able to deal with a wide variety of enemy profiles just with basic melee attacks, which not many of the other Space Marine chapters can really boast. Next up, we have Blood Angels, and these guys are certainly the melee powerhouses we could always expect from them. Their bespoke units like Death Company and Sanguinary Guard have incredible synergy internally with their characters, and they have one of the few detachment abilities that it just is a straight up melee damage buff. While their level of damage output in melee has certainly dropped from 9th edition, that's the case across the entire board, while being played within their detachment and making judicious use of their ability to gain lance effects on already high strength melee attacks, you can see enormous amounts of damage from these guys. Not to mention the fact that all of their characters grant great buffs to their units, and I do think that Blood Angels are going to be a solid contender moving on into the future. The real question is whether or not their detachment ability is worth giving up the Gladius assault doctrine, which would allow them to advance and charge. They can basically either pick between advancing and charging or getting all of their melee attack buffs. Now, last and definitely not least, by definition, we have the top tier of these chapters, the super good variety. The first one is Ultramarines, which basically just has a billion characters. As an Ultramarines player, you get access to Rabute Gilliman, and he already feels like an incredible force multiplier for Space Marine armies, giving you multiple free stratagems every battle round, and the ability to double up the effective modes of moment. Both of those are incredibly strong just by themselves, but also the smaller characters. Sergeants like Telion and Cronus just being able to buff the units that you are probably already including makes Ultramarines a lot more consistent than any of the other compliant chapters that you would normally be playing. While they don't have any unique mechanics, they do play the standard Space Marine game plan better than most of the other compliant chapters. So they don't have any special detachments, but the number of interesting and powerful characters you get access to, I think, makes up for it. They just do the Gladius Task Force better than most of the other armies. And last up, my pick for the very top is actually Deathwatch. Now, obviously, this is kind of hanging by a thread because I think Deathwatch is actually hanging by their Hellfire rounds stratagem. The amount of mortal wound production that Deathwatch are able to create currently is insane, even if you don't go all in on the ability of this stratagem to do devastating wounds. You can play a couple units with a high number of devastating wounds, weapons, dump the stratagem on them, and I think just do consistent damage to monsters and infantry, in addition to blowing up vehicles with the standard array of anti-armor Space Marine weapons. A couple kill teams and potentially some specific synergies to build around Hellfire rounds, I think just gives Deathwatch a slight edge over a standard Space Marine list using Gladius Task Force, but it does require you to play them in their detachment, which I think on the whole is a little bit worse. Now, for those who don't know, the interaction here is between the devastating wounds and anti-keyword. The anti-keyword grants you a critical wound on whatever the number says against whatever unit the anti is against. So an anti-infantry 2 will give you a 2+ critical wound against infantry. The Hellfire round stratagem gives you anti-infantry 2 and anti-monster 5 for all of the ranged weapons on a single unit. And you're able to use that on large Proteus teams that are all able to take the equivalent of combi weapons that have devastating wounds baked in, and 3 Terminators with assault cannons that similarly have devastating wounds baked in. So against infantry, all of your successful hits and then immediately turn into mortal wounds on a 2+, thanks to the anti-2+ ability. You're able to compound that with sustained hits and stacking up some other benefits, even taking it on things like a biker squad with an attached chaplain, granting the entire unit devastating wounds against an enemy within 12, a combo which I talked about in my video yesterday, actually allows them to do somewhere around 20 damage to an infantry squad basically by themselves. You can already equip lots of anti-vehicular weapons or armor cracking in a Space Marine army, and this basically just gives you the ability to sweep even through heavy infantry without a problem. There are some other benefits from playing Deathwatch. You do get access to their kill team that can create some interesting synergies with characters that you normally wouldn't be able to in a normal Space Marine chapter, and some of their enhancements are pretty strong. Tome of the Ectoclades gives you a once per game double Oaths of Moment, for example, allowing you to get full rerolls against a second enemy target that you choose. These are all good quality of life benefits, but really a lot of their strength is hanging off of those Hellfire rounds. That could get nerfed in the future, so we could see that change, but I think for the time being, it basically means that Deathwatch have the highest potential damage output for all of their different varieties of weapons. And with that, those are my opinions on the Space Marine power ranking for 10th edition Warhammer 40k. Let me know down in the comment section if you agree with this at all, or whether or not you think that I'm totally full of garbage. Again, these are sight unseen, and we don't quite have points yet for the game, so right now, it's a lot of supposition. I'm interested to see how things have developed as the 10th edition metagame progresses, and if you have any different opinions on where these chapters should be, let me know down in the comment section. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.